My name is Wayne Modest, and I'm one of the directors of this museum, which includes, is the World Museum now. When we started the Gerbrands 13 Gerbrands ago, or 12, we were still, I think, the National Museum of World Cultures, and with the title, the Museum Volkenkunde. Since then, so much has changed, I would suggest, in our societies. How we attend to questions around restitution and colonialism has been a hot point for thinking about what these museums are and what they can become in the future. And this particular institution, in a very special way, one could suggest, as an ethnographic museum, is at the center of these kinds of conversation. So when the time came to think about who the Gerbrands laureate for this year would be, it was self-evident. Self-evident because, as Mark will open up later on, the thinking but also the practical work that Professor Sarr has done has been central to how we as institutions have been thinking about the work that we are doing and want to do. So I would like to welcome you to this conversation. It is going to be a wonderful conversation, I'm sure. On behalf of a museum that is struggling with a set of concerns in the present, and not that we want to burden Professor Sarr with the solutions. Don't worry. We're not feeling that we're going to leave and say this is what it is. But rather, in the spirit of the Research Institute of our museum, we are more open to a practice of thinking with new conceptual tools, thinking with scholars who come from a different space, thinking with in an attempt to reimagine what our future could be. So welcome to the World Museum Leiden. And there are a few things that I want to ask you today. One of the requirements is that Professor Sarr has come from afar, and so I promised him, I didn't say it to him, but I promised him that the questions will be wonderful and that there will be a lot of them. And I also promise as an institution that our questioning is caring and careful, because that is a practice that we believe in this organization. Note, if there is an emergency, you have the exits here. And for those of you who might need a small break in between, because it might be run for a while, our restrooms are on the, not the ground floor, but the floor below that. And the lifts are available, or stairs are available. Welcome to the World Museum Leiden. Welcome to this conversation. And I invite Mark to kick us off in thinking about why Gerbrands, but also why Felwine. Mark.
Thank you, Wayne, for your kind introduction. Esteemed colleagues, honored guests, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you. I am, as is announced, Mark Westmoreland, a professor, associate professor of visual anthropology at Leiden University and the chair of the Gerbrands Lezing jury. Each year, colleagues from the Research Center for Material Culture of the World Museum, the Institute for Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology at Leiden University, and the Cineblend Ethnographic Film Program, among others, as we continue to open our jury to more interlocutors, join me to nominate an annual recipient for the Gerbrands Laureateship. The Gerbrands Laureateship was established to honor the late Professor Adriaan Alexander Gerbrands, who was a curator and vice director of the Volkenkunde Museum of Ethnography, now renamed as the World Museum Leiden. Known as the founding father of the Leiden School of Visual Ethnography, Gerbrands also became a professor of material culture and visual ethnography at Leiden University. Gerbrands is featured as one of Leiden's discoveries for his efforts to recognize the individual artistry of indigenous artworks being collected and put on display in the museum, which he addressed in his book, Wow Ippets, and intimately depicted in his ethnographic portrait film, Matyamosh, an Asmet wood carver. By combining the study of ethnocommunication and material culture, Gerbrands used a combination of exhibition curation and visual ethnography to thicken the museum goers' anthropological understanding. This film, Matyamosh, and many of the objects Gerbrands collected are still on display in the Oceania section of this museum. Over a decade ago, the Fund for Ethnology in Leiden established the Gerbrands Lecture to celebrate Adriaan Gerbrands' legacy, to renew the relationship between the National Museum, as it was then known, and the University of Leiden, and build relationships with partners in ethnographic film programming. At the same time, as we carry his legacy forward, we seek laureates who provide a critical mirror to our legacies of collecting and objectification, and offer a vision for where we must go. The laureateship thus represents an interdisciplinary field of research that critically addresses the troubling legacies and future promises of mediating social and cultural diversity within the Academy and the museum, as well as beyond both. Accordingly, the lecture series intends to introduce students and scholars and museologists to some of the most important work happening at the juncture of academic research and public-facing scholarship. The Gerbrands jury selects an annual laureate who has made seminal and lasting advances in the adjacent fields of the study, anthropology, material culture, museum studies, and many more at this point. We are particularly keen to highlight work that enacts groundbreaking theoretical interventions through both powerful rhetorical expression and refined practices of research creation that contribute to public debates. Previous laureates have included Howard Morphy, Faye Ginsberg, Finbar Barry Flood, Christopher Penny, Barbara Kischenblatt Gimblett, Stephen Feld, Tony Bennett, Ariella Ozule, jointly to Sami Balogi and Philip de Boek, Elizabeth Povinelli, Jason De Leon, and last year our second joint award to Deborah Thomas and John Jackson. Building on this legacy, I'm deeply honored to award the 13th Gerbrands Laureateship to Felwine Sarr. Before I invite him up to the stage, please allow me a few moments to elaborate on why the jury finds his work of such vital importance. Felwine Sarr is a Senegalese scholar, poet, and musician, born in the Saloum Delta. He pursued his studies in economics at the University of Orléans, where he earned his doctorate in 2006, graduating summa cum laude. The following year, he took up a position at University Gaston Berger of St. Louis in Senegal and went on to become Dean of the Economics and Management faculty in 2011. In 2017, he returned to France as a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Nantes and has been a visiting scholar in prominent universities in Johannesburg, Paris, Zurich, and New York. And in 2020, he was appointed the Anne-Marie Bryan Distinguished Professor in French and Francophone Studies at Duke University in North Carolina. His interdisciplinary approach bridges economics, philosophy, and cultural studies, thereby enabling him to dynamically address questions of African epistemology, post-colonial studies, and economic development. Sarr has published extensively on topics related to African economies, sustainable development, and the need for an African Renaissance, positioning him as a leading intellectual voice advocating for a reimagined African future grounded in the continent's own cultural and intellectual traditions. While his oeuvre includes both works of fiction and nonfiction, he often moves easily between genres. In his 2012 book, African Meditations, in which Sarr reflects on reacclimating to his native Senegal as a young academic after years of study abroad, their narrative offers a, quote, seamless blend of autobiography, journal entries, and fiction, aphorisms and brief narrative sketches, humor, and Zen reflections. In the foreword, Soliman Bashir Danier captures the spirit of Sarr's meditations in action as, quote, a concentrated form of signification that asks the reader to pause and reflect, to recite the phrases back to themselves, to slowly open these flowers of thought, along with them, their petals replete with meaning. Such as in the passage at the end of the first chapter, I quote, the July light permeated the entire abode. The tiniest particles of dust, stunned by their own intimacy, immigrated to the darkest corners of the dwelling. Two consciousnesses, face to face, silence no longer was capable of containing the truth of their being. Such being should burst forth, but words could not bear this weight. It was all too cumbersome for them. The house had become the site of an impossible encounter for all of them. Tumai could feel it in his bones that what he was feeling, no ear was prepared to hear. Society didn't provide spaces for such words to be expressed in the light of day. Society merely provided a place for those words that continued to maintain its foundations and help it uphold the status quo. Silence merely authorized resentment and bad faith. Through the book, Sarr's self-stylized protagonist traverses a semi-surrealistic landscape, navigating academia, finding a foothold in his roots, and, quote, gleaning something of the good life, of joy, amid the struggles of life in Senegal. As an economist, Sarr has been unwavering in his critique of traditional economic growth models, instead proposing more holistic and context-specific approaches to development. In his noteworthy book, Afrotopia, Sarr advocates for rethinking development not merely as economic growth, but as a holistic improvement of life, integrating cultural, social, and spiritual dimensions. By challenging Western-centric models of progress, he calls for an African utopian philosophy of self-reinvention, rooted in the values, history, and experiences of the continent. He calls for African intellectuals to shift the focus away from Western epistemologies that allow African societies to reclaim their intellectual and cultural heritage in order to create new modes of thought that can shape the continent's future. This position builds on his recognition that Africa has once again become a site of creative potential and a vibrant center of economic growth and production. Rather than remaining mired in stereotypes and traumas that lead down predictable pathways, he implores the continent to set out on a path of self-renewal based on tapping into its vast mythological universe. By elaborating Africa's unique philosophies of communal value expressed in concepts such as Ubuntu, Imihigo, and Teranga, Sarr argues that African societies would be better positioned to tackle crucial issues from climate change to demographic pressures. This speaks to Sarr's broader intellectual project to break down the barriers between different forms of knowledge in order to forge new relationships. This effort to write toward an African humanities proposes to rethink the plurality of the journeys of human thinking that insist on the equality of different schools of thought while acknowledging their incommensurability. To achieve this, it is necessary to adopt modes of understanding reality that are not limited to scientific knowledge. His influence over scholarship has been wide-ranging and multifaceted. Aside from serving as editor for the Review Journal of African Transformation, he co-founded the Pan-African publishing house Jemsan in Senegal with the writers Boubacar Boris Diop and Nafissatou Dia to address the disparities of a publishing world based on old colonial power dynamics and instead foreground a mutual respect between author and publisher. Along similar lines, he launched the Atelier de la Pensée with Achille Mbembe in Dakar and St. Louis to bring together dozens of African and diasporic intellectuals and artists, particularly among a new generation. They advanced forms of collaboration that would give greater visibility, density, and strength to Afro-diasporic thinking, writing, and creation, all in order to take stock and respond to the challenges facing Africa and the world today. Among its outputs, their recent collection of essays called To Write the African World encapsulates these ideas beautifully and demonstrates the potential of what might be called a multimodal approach. I quote from their introduction: "We therefore find ourselves at a propitious moment to relaunch a project of critical thought, what we call a practice of creation, that will draw its forces and originality through an encounter between the humanities, the disciplines of the imagination, and what we can refer to in a general manner as the arts of the living. For as far as we are concerned, critical thought is not merely limited to the production of philosophical text. Far from it. It comprises both literary and a non-discursive corpus, be it graphical or pictorial. It includes a multiplicity of gestures, fields, and styles, which include music and dance, architecture and photography, as well as cinema, among others. It gathers together all practices of writing, of creation, interpretation, and imagination. On the African continent and in its diasporas, over the past decade, we have also started to notice an upswing in intellectual artistic creativity, a rekindled vitality in the principled themes, and the fervent desire to renew the forms, the frameworks of thought, and the attempts to grasp the real in the process of being created. So, we see here that there is something worth exploring and creatively playing with, a new toolbox that we can make use of in order to construct something else with our creative energies. If these references are new to you, and I hope they do entice you to learn more about Sarr's work, I imagine most of you know of his hugely impactful work on cultural restitution that has reasserted Africa's place in urgent global conversations. Indeed, Sarr gained international prominence as the co-author of the Sarr-Savoy report, which was commissioned by French President Emmanuel Macron in 2018. Along with art historian Bénédicte Savoy, Sarr produced a groundbreaking report that called for the restitution of African cultural artifacts that had been taken, that had been taken during the colonial period. Therein, they bring to the surface the astonishing fact that 90% of African cultural heritage currently exists outside of the continent, and much of it is in display in major Western museums, like this one. This report has been pivotal in advancing debates about the return of looted art and the broader conversations about the legacy of colonialism in Europe and Africa. The report has profoundly impacted European museum perspectives, compelling multiple Western institutions and governments to commit, at least, to returning artifacts acquired through force, clandestine excavation, corruption, or theft. In recognition of this work, Time magazine listed Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy among the 100 most influential people of 2021. After many years engaged in a dyadic relationship between Africa and Europe, he said that his move to the US has opened up new epistemological spaces, at once offering a triangular perspective and an opportunity to reorient his activities outside of economics. Perhaps this offers us more ways to appreciate his diverse body of work. Beyond his academic and economic analysis, Sarr is also a poet and a musician, contributing to African culture and philosophy in multiple forms. While his literary works often reflect on African identity, culture, and the possibility of a new African humanism that is distinct from both colonial and post-colonial legacies, he is also an accomplished musician who has published at least 3 albums. In recent years, he has begun to adapt his writing for the stage, pushing him to give renewed consideration to voice, orality, and the body. This work has addressed the genocide of Tutsis in Rwanda in the play We Call It Love. In the play Freedom, he brings into dialogue the distinct figures of Frantz Fanon and French poet René Char to explore the role of the Rin text in the context of a politically active life. And in the play Traces, he offers a speech to the youth of Africa, a kind of retelling of the continent's long history that is not limited to dark or depressing episodes, but contains the possibility for them to become subjects of their own destiny once again. In sum, while he has understandably been called one of the most influential contemporary African intellectuals, it would be more accurate to recognize him as one of the world's most interesting and influential thinkers who is playing a vital role in resituating Africa in our imagination. Today, Professor Sarr will address many of these topics in his lecture, Knowledge on/in African Societies, Reopening the Paths. He will ask us to consider core epistemological questions and how our knowledge paradigms sustain and reproduce particular kinds of political, economic, and social order. He offers us crucial points to consider in the project of decolonization and what we might be able to call a re-Africanization of philosophical and scientific knowledge. While this gesture draws upon rich and diverse traditions, he will undoubtedly offer us new ways to imagine the world while reminding us of Africa's invariable importance in addressing its future. Please give a warm welcome to the 2024 Gerbrands Laureate, Professor Felwine Sarr.
So thank you, Wayne, for your warm welcoming words, and thank you, Mark, for your so generous introduction. Thank you very much. And I want also to deeply thank the jury of the Gerbrands Prize, who has chosen to highlight my work this year. I'm grateful for that. And I'm also very happy to be here in Leiden. That is a beautiful city I was just discovering yesterday. And I had a kind of cultural shock. It was the first time I experienced more bicycle than cars, and it was very impressive for me, to witness that. So the lecture I'm going to give is titled Knowledge on/in African Countries, Reopening the Path. In the context of the necessity of the elaboration of new forms of life, new forms of economic, social, political life in the African countries, the issue of knowledge production is crucial. Not only because the African continent has challenges to face in terms of education, health, and well-being in an era of economy based on innovation and knowledge, but more fundamentally because knowledge production sustain, reproduce political, economical, and social orders. So the epistemological question of what type of knowledge is, how are they produced, for which purpose, are fundamental for Africans in their fight for emancipation. In order to imagine and build different present and future, it's necessary to interrogate the enunciation of knowledge paradigms. If you look back in the history, in the recent history of the African continent, the so-called ethnologic knowledge produced on African societies played a critical role in its domination by European countries during the colonial period. In the contemporary era, knowledge allows a control or a regulation of the understanding of the world. With knowledge, you can see some words and you can just veil other words. You don't see them. In that sense, knowledge is a space of power and can also be an instrument of coloniality. To think properly the challenges that are currently facing African societies, it's necessary to interrogate the geopolitics of knowledge within the African continent. And I will start by doing a quick genealogy of what Valentin Mudimbe named the colonial library and emphasize the African contemporary positionality. In a second moment, I will discuss the necessity for African to engage an epistemic shift by widening the vision of what a knowledge is, but also by reactivating resources of knowing embodied in their culture, but more specifically by producing new knowledges that will be useful for African and for the world in general. And I will finish by drawing the main path of what I call an African ecology of knowledges. The corpus of knowledge about Africa, the ancient corpus, but I'm still here, is largely marked by colonial ethnology and anthropology, even though there is an attempt to renew that corpus, but the trace is here. Valentin Mudimbe named this corpus the colonial library. Since the 15th century, the landscape of Africa has been structured by discourse, whose objective was to physically dominate the land, to re-educate the mentalities of native inhabitants, and to integrate the local economic histories in a Western perspective. These various forms of knowledge, whose goal was the justification and the establishment of the colonial enterprise, viewed non-Western countries through the prism of cultural superiority and racial prejudice. In fact, maintaining an economic asymmetry between the colonies and the metropole implied that the latter exerted an absolute political control over the colonies, and yet this control would have been impossible without largely shared belief in the cultural dominance of the colonizers. It was of vital importance for the colonizer to establish this sense of superiority, to not simply conquer the land and the resources, but also the hearts and the minds. As a result, the economic and political injustice that is inherent in colonization adds one more layer of cultural injustice. This process is called by Rajev Bhargava epistemic injustice. It took place in the same way in India and in African countries. And epistemic injustice starts when concepts and categories thanks to which a people or a community understand itself, as well as its universe, are replaced by the concepts and the categories of the colonizers. Therefore, the system of meaning and categories allowing for the individual and the collective orientation of dominate people have been replaced by the meaning and the categories of the colonists. And this has been done by a denigration of the value of the local community, as well as their production of knowledge. This process of inferiorizing the cultural and epistemic frameworks belonging to colonized people is first deployed within the discourse of the colonizers, but then became crystallized within the theoretical work of ethnologists, anthropologists, carried out by the colonizers. For Valentin Mudimbe, Kwasi Wiredu, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for Africans to deeply recover their fecundity, it's urgent to address the question of the liberation of African philosophical and scientific discourse to establish what they call African social sciences or humanities. For these thinkers, it's important to become the subject of one's own scientific discourse and to determine its practice according to one's own norms and criteria. For Mudimbe and Wiredu, there is a necessity of performing a radical transformation of the social and human sciences as they are currently taught in African universities. This reconstruction project requires reworking the social science and humanities, starting with the epistemological interrogation concerning the object, the methods and status of knowledge produced by the human and social science as they are applied to African realities. Deconstructing the colonial ethnological reason start with a radical critique of the produced discourse, a radical critique of their theoretical framework and their ideological underpinnings. For these thinkers, in order to finally escape from a scientific alienation that is constantly laying in wait, African researchers must take on the responsibility of a thought by establishing a scientific discourse that will be the expression of material life within their own socio-political context. This activity of thinking must root itself within the present, placing a careful attention on its own specific archaeological environment and the real tendencies of Africa's various and diverse societies and their most complete and concrete expressions. It's a question of integrating the true complexity of African social formation and no longer considering them as carbon copies of Western history, but having their own cultural and historical specificity. So the question is then what to do with the colonial library. Do we have to burn it? Some African scholars, Antoine Chitungu Kongolo or Mamadou Diouf, think that for this enterprise, a critical rereading of the colonial library is an accurate option for several reasons. So they don't advocate a burning of the colonial library, but they advocate a critical rereading of it for two main reasons. So the first is that in their view, the colonial library is a co-production, and as a part of the knowledge is produced by African society is intertwined in that library, and those knowledge could be rediscovered by a critical reading. The second argument they have is that a critical reading of this library helps to understand how the Western world produced knowledge about others. In the Descent of the Father, a book of Valentin Mudimbe, so Valentin Mudimbe shows how scientific production can be dependent on the categories of thought that are both their own and those of others, a category of thought that speaks from specific geographical, but also philosophical and epistemological places. How then does one get rid of the persistent scent or the smell of the father while avoiding the pitfall of challenging his discourse with words inspired by him? The father is now absent, but remains present through his scent. And the father refers here to a certain epistemological paternalism that has been established and that has infantilized Africa. How can this filiation be broken to produce an African order of scientific discourse in line with African realities? For Africa, says Mudimbe, I quote him, to escape from the West, supposed to appreciate exactly what it costs to detach oneself from it. It's supposed to know up to which point the West insidiously approach us. It makes it possible to know in what allows us to think against the West what is still Western. All the ambiguity and the difficulty of an epistemic decolonization is summarized in this quote. It is that of the implementation of a fertile gap which will have elucidate the current modalities of the integration of Africans in the myth of the West, while at the same time avoiding the need to prove its humanity in the face of the ideological, political, sometimes symbolic violence that is opposed to it. Mudimbe advocates to freely assume the responsibility of a thought which relates to its destiny and its environment. In his view, the constitution of an African scientific practice does not only suppose a strategy of decolonization of established knowledge, but also to define the framework and the condition of a true scientific practice that Africa needs most urgently today. So what would be the tools, the concept, the categories, as well as the methodology of such reconstruction, rehabilitation, or reinvention? The strategy and the method he proposed is one of an epistemological indiscipline. It's necessary to think from the African experience, and for this epistemological indiscipline, all knowledge must be reopened. The reopening for Mudimbe is not a return to a pre-colonial state of civilization or knowledge production, but the reopening is rather a question of developing a critical point of view on philosophical traditions and endogenous knowledge to raise what is relevant to preserve or to transform, and what is not relevant to preserve or to transform, to just leave it. So the question I want to address below this, and after the take of Mudimbe, Ngugi, and Wiredu, is how to rewrite the so-called humanity from an African perspective. The epistemic shift I am calling for is not just a better application of Western human and social science, the so-called humanity, to African reality, or a better inculturation of the latter. My point is that we must acknowledge the diversity of approach to reality, depending on civilization and eras, a plurality of way of knowing, as well as a museological and epistemological plurality. I propose to rethink the plurality of journeys of human thinking, starting from the idea of equality in principle of different traditions of thought or discursive practices, while acknowledging sometimes their incommensurability. This leads us to consider these different traditions of thought from their horizons and the configuration of the thinkable which they propose as unique journeys of the mind which have developed concurrently, shaped by the culture from which they originate. This does not mean that there is no circulation of ideas and thought across region and era. It's not a question of being autarkic. Thinking about this question in an African context called for an epistemic shift. And it has already been told, incorporating the complexity of African social structure and embracing them in their cultural and historical distinctiveness in knowledge productions. But more fundamentally, it's a question of acquiring more in-depth knowledge of African societies and culture, which are also based on their own museological criteria. The question is not just knowing Africa from the outside, from the eyes of the ethnological and anthropological prism, but Wole Soyinka said that in a book, Africans haven't weighed the encounter with the other to know themselves. So they have their own museological criteria within their culture. So it's also a way of knowing them deeply by just shifting the gaze. So to achieve this, it's necessary to adopt as a mode of understanding reality, besides scientific knowledge, as it is currently constituted. The exploration of the relative unfamiliar territories of what I call African epistemogonies allows a more open-minded approach to various types of knowledge that have helped and safeguard African societies in their long history. These constitute ways of knowing which have demonstrated their long-term operational attributes in different areas of human life, so therapeutic and environmental knowledge, technical know-how, social knowledge, historical, psychological, economic, agronomical knowledge, etc. And this knowledge has ensured the survival, the growth, and the sustainability of African societies in the long term. In order to mobilize them, it's necessary to explore African multiple cultural expression and also the linguistic resources of African societies. I also engage in a debate around a theory of knowledge that is not limited by the boundaries of the vision, of the Western vision of knowledge, by questioning the exclusivity of the logocentric episteme and the inframing of modes of comprehensibility by the single mode of writing thought. It's about reconsidering the question of knowledge at its very roots. Rebuilding knowledge in Africa could be pursued by setting up an ecology of knowledges, where disciplines, approach, and methodologies are considered in their own integrity, but put in an ecology where they can interact and produce new knowledges. I borrow from Margarita Bowen and Boaventura da Souza Santos the notion of ecology of knowledge. While accepting that knowledge is derived from experience, the notion of ecology of knowledge looks to a much broader notion of experience, consonant with a more dynamic ecosystem understanding of the world. Margarita Bowen, the Australian historian of science, who suggests in 1985 the notion or the term ecology of knowledge, emphasized that all ideas or actions that are issued from observation are themselves incorporate and part of the global ecosystem. This evidence suggests a radical break from the established and positivist model of exact scientific method in which the scientist was regarded as being detached intellectually, at least from the object of observations, and so able to collect reliable data, objective facts, by sense perception analysis to ensure accuracy. David Lowenthal, 1961, argued that perception is not a matter of sense alone. Sensing, thinking, feeling, and believing are simultaneous and interdependent processes. The question that we might ask ourselves could be this one. Can we widen the notion of perception? Can we envisage an epistemology of the senses? Can we consider art, dance, theater, and bodies as sites of knowledge? Can we also consider an epistemology of the complexity, consonant with the late understanding brought by Einstein and the quantum physics of the reality of the universe and breaking with the Newtonian paradigm? The idea here is to recognize an epistemological pluralism which acknowledges the specificity and the particularity of science and its efficiency in some domains, while contesting its pretension to the monopoly of truth and its aim to disqualify other forms of knowledges. My point is to contest the scientific pretension of being the only legitimate and true knowledge in one hand, but also the postmodern relativism according to which all knowledge are equal on the other hand. The idea is not to attribute the same ability or capacity to all types of knowledge, but to allow a pragmatic discussion between the alternative ways of knowing, a discussion that does not immediately disqualify knowledge that are outside of the scientific canon. Rebuilding knowledge in Africa is being able to rely on all types of knowledge produced by African societies through time and reactivate those that still operate in various domains of life. This means ending with a monoculture of knowing by allowing a constellation of various knowledge that interact, that are complementary, and also knowledges that can be translated one into another by avoiding the fragmentation and the non-communicabilities of various types of knowledges. Also, going beyond the idea that knowledge are situated and exclusively depend on the condition of their productions, knowledge is at the same time situate and trans-situate. Human intelligence lies in our ability to go beyond the various possibilities of thinking, to understand them and generate dialogue between them. An ecology of knowledge will not be a systematic research for the ultimate truth, but rather an attempt to present these possibilities in order to produce something intelligible and useful from the encounters of a pluralities of ways of knowing and discursive practice. The ultimate objective of this epistemological shift is the construction of a library that encompasses all the libraries. The library of the logos, the library of the non-logos, the anti- and anti-colonial epistemologies, the post-colonial, the decolonial libraries, articulating various archives, thought, and knowledge that are disseminated in the societies. And this library enables the production of new knowledges and new ways of knowing, as well as an integral recognition of ignorance. Ignorance embodies what is ignored, what is not considered as knowledge, but also what we don't know yet. And it's therefore what we don't know yet, a space of creativity and innovation. And the ambition of such an ecology of knowledge could be in synchrony and diachrony to study the life of the ideas, their present and their future, historical variation in the response to fundamental human questions expressed in the collective thinking of a large group of individuals. Therefore, reflecting on social transformation and cultural production of a linguistic era necessitate an understanding of the global environment that produces meanings. This is justified by the fact that philosophical statements, scholarly conjectures, literary processes, or recurrent poetic images only really take meaning connected to each other in the interactive topography of the entire social discourse. So we have to look at the entire social discourse to draw this type of meanings. In that perspective, an African ecologist of knowledge could become a multidisciplinary enterprise that explores both scientific knowledge, literature, as well as the arts, the practical solution, and the collective belief, the material productions, theoretical knowledge in their refined and simplistic versions, literate or not. And this African ecologies of knowledge must go beyond the analysis of specific discursive fields and genre, philosophical, religious, scientific, literary, etc. Such an undertaking in the context of African countries raised the question of the sources of the archive, and in particular the question of the oral sources, carrier of an important part of the collective memory and the knowledge production in African societies. It should be remembered that African societies have experienced writing systems that have played differentiated role in archiving and transmitting their cultural heritage. But for us, it's more a matter of moving away from the hegemony of the scriptural paradigm, which sees writing as the exclusive mean of transmitting the collective memory. Many human groups did not need writing to transmit their cultural heritage. There is no human group without languages, and therefore without codified means of perpetuating its collective memory through time. It's about questioning this culture through the processes they have mainly used to transmit their knowledge and their collective memory. In the African context, in addition to exploring written and oral sources, artifacts and so-called objects / subject can also play a significant role in an archaeology of knowledges. They can help the rewriting of history. They also encompass knowledge and indicate alternative epistemological universe. Every society, every culture, every civilization transmit an heritage and perpetuate a cultural matrix that convey its identity through time, while at the same time transforming this identity as the world evolves. The question is how to characterize this transformation. If we open the methodological scope and shift the geography of our reason, an ecology of knowledge, it can be a field of studying major questions of our time based on more plural archive and ways of knowing. In conclusion, to face the challenges that the African continent is dealing with, it's urgent to improve and better appropriate the modern scientific knowledge and its technical application. This creative assimilation is a trend that is already observed in many African countries, in which the new technologies are used to provide a solution in health, education, etc., etc. But furthermore, it's a question of widening the range of knowledge on which the social organizations are based by incorporating in the repertoire of useful tools the knowledge produced by African societies and embodied in their cultural matrix and their DNA. An additional task that is devoted to the African scholars is to produce the knowledge that will be needed by African societies in the upcoming decades in order to better respond to their need and answer their challenges. Reopening the future for African countries is a task that will take place, firstly, in the space of thought and imaginaries, the two. So the African continent is actually experiencing a cultural mutations. The continent can become a laboratory and reinvent in its site economic, politic, and social life. To give forms to this reinvention is to rebuild knowledge and imaginaries. Rebuilding knowledge in Africa could open up to an infinite universe. So thank you for your kind listening.
Yeah, what we propose to do is is a conversation. So first of all, thank you. And I realized that in my opening I had, because of the position that, where I'm thinking now, where restitution inhabits much of our conversation, that I had actually not remembered that our first engagement with your work was not so much in restitution, but with Afrotopia, and an exhibition that we hosted in one of our museums around that, the concept. Perhaps to start out, I was just at a PhD defense in Rotterdam, and one of the starting conversations that we had was around the question of disciplines and different disciplines. And I had said to them that I'm a cultural studies person, so I'm promiscuous in my disciplinary interest. My methods are promiscuous in that sense. And so I'm interested in not only in Mark's introduction of your work, but also in how you articulated what it is you can imagine that do we hold on to the disciplinary boundaries of philosophy, of anthropology, and are those disciplinary silos themselves not a hindrance to the kind of futures that you are trying to imagine? So I want to probably start out with that. And I'm going to move from that to music and dance and the body, but let's start out with that one.
So probably the question of the disciplines is that at the beginning they are very useful because the knowledge is wide. And I think after the Middle Age, in the late antiquity, you have people, or I would say scholars of that time, that were able to know a lot of things, everything. And I think the reality was just cut in small portions to allow scholars to be able to dive and to dig deeper and to gain more knowledge. And in physics, it has been very useful to just create disciplines and specialize scholars in each disciplines. The social sciences have tried to take the same attitude than the so-called hard sciences. But the problem is that when you piece back the reality, when you cut the reality in small portions and you try to just reflect on it, the reality has a density, it's a totality. Social facts and objects are not on one plane and one surface. It became difficult to piece back the reality and to be able to see it in a holistic way. And I think the challenges we have is that we are more knowledgeable, but less intelligent. We know more things, a lot of things, but we are not able to just connect the dots. And I think it's where interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary enterprise, even though it's beautiful, it's difficult to really apply, but it's where it's important to try, and I use the word try. It's an attempt to just look the object from different perspectives and to use what you think are the adequate tools to do that. It's not easy to do, but I think it's a way of probably having less knowledge and more intelligibility of the reality. So discipline is at the same time a discipline because you need it to move forward, but at the same time you have to undiscipline yourself to just go beyond. And when are you undisciplining? At which stage? It's a delicate question.
I want to come back to that later on because I think, especially now or in your role as an academic and teaching students, then the question is also how do you teach? What kind of pedagogical models are we going to put in place to make people more, what was it? Knowledgeable and and intelligent. So what kind of pedagogical models do we employ? But before that, though, there was also one other thing that struck me, because we here are very involved in a question, also in terms of restitution, around the question of decolonization and the decolonization of knowledge. And I remember not only engaging with the book of Olufemi Tao, but also that he was here in Leiden at the Africa Studies Center, where there was a question in his question about against decolonization. And I think one of the things that he was suggesting was, I think in that proposal, was the ways in which some of the argument of decolonization sometimes imagine a kind of purity of African knowledges as opposed to Europe, and idea that one has to destroy one. Your suggestion was otherwise.
Yes, I think the question is a different one. I think in the terms decolonizations, there's a lot to understand in the term. If you read the Latin American thinkers, they talk about the coloniality of the being, of the knowledge. And the idea is that the so-called colonial knowledge still produce violence and epistemic violence. And even though the non-African had to decolonize it, to go beyond the abyss that knowledge produces. You can just be a servant of an order of knowledge that reproduce hegemony of the dominant, that reproduce economic injustice, that reproduce all the bad things that happens in the world. It depends where we are. So you can just love knowledge without being aware that knowledge is a power, and you have to think this knowledge, what this knowledge is standing for, this type of knowledge I'm contributing to build. So it's not a romantic idea of, because the scholars, we love knowing, we love libraries, we love knowledge, and sometimes we don't interrogate ourselves to what type of enterprise am I contributing. You can decide to work for a knowledge that emancipates people and in their life. So it's a choice to be made. I think the question of decolonization is not the question of purity. It's a question of standing, of just asking ourselves, which type of knowledge am I contributing to, for which purpose, for which social, is it knowledge that will reproduce the hegemonies and the injustice, or a knowledge that will emancipate? African knowledge, as all types of knowledge, had a dimension of hybridity. People that produce knowledge always borrow to their environment, to other form of knowing, to what operates better. And if you do an archaeology of what the so-called knowledge produced in African society, you'll see that there are already syntheses of different types of knowledge. So the question is not the synthesis, the question is what you are bringing into and what you are doing with that type of knowledge. And the question were raised by Valentin Moudimbe in his book, L'odeur du père, the scent of the father. And when he was thinking of this question of how to deal with the Western epistemology's concept, at the same time, if you want to get rid of them, why do you want to get rid of them? Is it because they are not yet rational, or is it just a philosophical or an ideological question? And I think the question is more the accuracy of the knowledge. If, to example, I'm an economist, the knowledge about economic development is not accurate at all. It's not accurate at all. And during years and years, African leaders have been convinced that they have to replicate the economic model that doesn't function. And when they function somewhere in the world, in Asia, we call it a miracle, the Asian miracle. It means that it's not the normal way of doing things. And that knowledge is not accurate. It has to be decolonized and probably produce a knowledge around an economy of well-being that will respond to the need of the people. So the question is there. The question is not purity, etc., etc. The question is, where do you stand, in which part of the river, and why knowing and how to know, etc. If you look at the history of African countries, there is a lot to decolonize in the so-written history, because some of this knowledge is not accurate. If you went to a museum and you look at a cartel around an object, and a part of the knowledge that is there, not all, is not accurate.
I just wanted to, because one of the things that I was thinking about is, I'm from the Caribbean, I'm from Jamaica, and when you were talking, there is a Jamaican word science, and science is not science, it is another form of science. So it is science that is based in the spirits and not science that is based in the university. And I always say that my mother believed both in science, and then she believed in Jesus. So all three come together in one. My last question before I wanted to open it a little bit for the audience is if one were to, and you go to Mineola, and my starting point is with Mineola and decolonize, but it's a little bit different with Sylvia Winter and others. And in thinking about your demand for us to think about the relationship between epistemologies and the human and humanities, right? There are much of us now also coming from Latin America who are not so sure that they want to stay with the human and the humanities in the same way, especially in relationship to a more than human, and not post-human, but more than human. Absolutely. Why a commitment still to?
No, I think humanities is a category in which you have social science and human sciences. So when you say humanities, you're not talking about the humans. You're talking about these epistemological categories. Even though there is a line of thought that is interesting, actually, that to try to tackle ecological questions by thinking beyond the human, by trying to take care of the non-human, the more than the human, etc., etc. And it's always a challenge to think around a category that had his own limitations, a desire of moving beyond, but that is used in the languages because the conversation is based on the consensus around notion and the category. Even though development, we have to use it, even though we want to go beyond it. So, and Sylvia Winter is interesting because she's reflecting on human as a praxis, and she's reflecting on a more than social science visions to articulate social science, neuroscience, biology, etc., etc., and to articulate from different line of, and to go beyond the borders of the so-called humanity. And this idea that every knowledge that is produced is here to sustain and reproduce our orders, our social orders. So if we want to change our social orders, we just have to produce different type of knowledges that will produce different types of reality. And the question is how to get rid of an epistemology of the recursivity. If we think that the recursivity is not the right way, if we think that we have to change reality, how to be able to produce knowledges that free us from the recursive epistemologies. So I think it's always an interesting conversation in this idea of using categories, but at the same time, desire of going beyond those categories. And even though if you invent a new category, you have to wait the time of a new consensus of the meaning of these categories to be able to bring it in the conversation.
I mean, I like that as well, but also because in the distinction that some scholars make between a post-humanism, which means after, and a more than humanism, or more than human. In more than human, the human still remains. So the category still remains, but there is more to attend to. Can I open for questions? Oh, yes, start already. Good. Who runs? I run? You run, Ilaria? All right, Ilaria will run. And don't mind if I start standing and move around.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarr. I loved every moment of that talk. I'm discovering your work for the first time through this talk, so I appreciate this opportunity and I appreciate that you're here with us. My question is about this notion of setting up an ecology of knowledge. My question is, who do you imagine is going to be doing this, and with which resources? For example, I'm thinking of I'm working with a colleague in Ghana. I am also Ghanaian and British myself, and when I think about a scholar in Africa, like my colleague, in the University of Ghana. They're operating in a colonial university and within a colonial state that neglects knowledge altogether. And sometimes is actively hostile to certain forms of knowledge, certainly is not interested in decolonization. So I'm just wondering, can you provide examples from your own practices or those of colleagues that you know, how they've decolonized in those kinds of contexts? I mean, who are you imagining doing this? Is it even going to be scholars, or is it people in society themselves doing this? Thank you very much.
So thank you for this question. In Senegal, when I was teaching in Gaston Berger, so we had a kind of a meeting with the deans and the provost, and it was the time that the university decided to create more faculties and departments. And one of the questions was, how would we be able to bring African knowledges in the university? And we create a new faculty, we call it CRAC, Civilization, Religion, Art, and Communication, in which we taught African languages from the first year to the PhD, so social linguistic, literature in Wolof, in Pular, in Hausa. We bring religion in a center of religious studies, so the African religion, the Semitic one, the Oriental ones. We bring music, dance, and arts in the department. We bring communication and infography, and we bring studies around African patrimony. And I was in charge to build this new faculty. And I work on it, and I build it with colleagues. We hire new scholars, we hire new students, we hire new administration, and it was the first experience of Africanizing knowledge in 2011, and I directed it during 3 years, and this department is still existing with a lot of students and learning literature in African languages, learning a lot of knowledge that came from African societies. So if there is I would say a political will first, because you need some resources to build that. And scholars that are engaged in their fields, you can do that. The question, I think it's a question of imaginaries. Our leaders, they don't consider that we are producers of knowledge. They consider that the knowledge must come from outside. Even though they don't acknowledge that their societies are built mainly on knowledge produced by their societies. And before they encountered the other, they were sustaining their life by producing knowledge and disseminating different types of knowledge that help them survive in the long term and build their history in the long term. So I think probably one of the tasks is to convince I think the African scholar, they know it, but you arrive, there is a framework, you have to teach this discipline, etc. And probably you can have your ideas, so you can do something in your class, okay, by diversifying the resources, etc. But you can't do too much if there is not, I would say, a political will to build those type of infrastructure. And just one more thing before I stop there. The universities were created in the Middle Age in Europe. The US, when they build a university, they mimic the European universities of the Middle Age, but quickly they turn their universities towards the need of their society. In Asia, they did the same thing. They mimicked the US university, but very quickly they turned their universities towards the needs of their society. It's not the case in African countries. You have few examples here and there, but I think it's a question of just walking through the imaginaries of what knowledge is, what knowledge deserves to be in the university, and to acknowledge deeply that African societies are producing knowledge since a very long time.
Can I, is fine, good answer? All right, great. No, can I just hold on to that a little bit, just as because there is also a time-based thing to it. In the Caribbean, just at the moment of independence in the 1960s, there was this joyous hope. And in that joyous hope, that was how the university was conceived. The university was conceived as local, built for locals, drawing actually on Africa for what we imagined pedagogy should look like, or how learning should be like. on the campus of the University of the West Indies was a folk philosophy unit where Rastafari would come and philosophize as part of philosophy. But as that hope for a possible future got caught up in neoliberal projects, then right now the university has evacuated all of that. It doesn't want the humanities anymore. Everything needs to go to economic development. Is that also the case in the institutions in which you are working? That there is also another kind of exigency, which is about living?
Yes, because one of the questions is that the university produce a knowledge that is rewarded by the economic market of knowing. So if the market of knowledge don't reward the knowledge that you are producing, you don't have credits to produce that type of knowledge. So if this is not important for this place, so they are not going to invest, the market is not going. So the first question is to be able to acknowledge the type of knowledge driven by the market. And the market knows what he needs to just reproduce itself. And there is a notion that I like from Boaventura da Sousa Santos that called abyssal knowledge, the knowledge that the market produces. So probably a state must free itself from just being trapped in the production of an abyssal knowledge and just reflect on the needs of knowledge that the society have, and finance those types, so finance the so-called humanity. So we have two challenges. So we have the challenge of a knowledge driven by the economy of knowing, the neoliberal economy of knowing, and also be able to find resources in institutional places that will produce knowledge outside of the economic-driven system of knowledge production.
And perhaps here we can come back a little bit to the question of performance, yes, and the body and embodiment and art.
Yes, and probably also consider that university is not the only sites of knowledge productions. Yeah. So there are a variety of sites, and those sites are sometimes in society, sometimes they have to be acknowledged, sometimes they have to be built, and just get rid of the hegemony of being the only place where knowledge is produced and sustained.
One more question. Here, a question. And can I just get two questions then? You first, and then do them together, and then Felwine can answer.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarr, and thank you very much for the question. I am also a scholar who focuses mainly on restitution of art that has been looted from obviously colonial countries, or colonized countries, excuse me. But I often wonder about how African society specifically would have progressed had a lot of objects not left. And listening to your talk made me wonder if that is kind of the place that we're, or you specifically, or I guess African scholarship is trying to get back to, a place of what could have been if these objects accompanied with this knowledge had not left Africa or had not been taken from Africa.
Yeah, then is your question kind of related?
It's fine.
All right, it's fine. All right. Oh, no, that question first. Sorry, we have to keep order. Yeah, sorry. And I had acknowledged him before. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture and talk. Two questions in one. One related, you said about resources and imaginaries, and for scholars who work across African universities and also universities in the West, but where we see a lot of inequalities in partnerships and knowledge production and knowledge creation because of sources of funding, for instance, formalities of partnerships, how also how this can be, also how African scholars can take this into considerations in also establishing these partnerships between Western universities and African universities that ensure that actually African knowledge is dominant in this type of partnerships and in this proposal. And also, as a scholar yourself, also moving between working in Western universities, but also being embedded in African universities and African knowledge creation ecosystem. Like, what's also your take on your positionality yourself, moving between these two different, type of very different also knowledge systems? Thank you.
I will start by you because it's more fresh. So the question, so there's it's an intertwined question. The first dimension is that most of the research agenda of, if I say our university, I'm thinking on African universities, most of the research agenda is driven by the Western research agenda because it's the Western research agenda that finances the cooperations. And here it's a vulnerability and a lack of our authorities, our government, our leadership. They don't invest in research. Even though there is no, in Senegal, there is not a national center of research that decide these are the critical questions for Senegal during the 10 coming years, and you have to invest and ask the Senegalese scholar to reflect and work on it. So you do your own research based on your own desire, but if you want to be financed, you have to be in cooperation with a research project. And the agenda of this research project is thought, built outside of your country. And you have your own interests because you will publish a paper, etc., etc., etc. But fundamentally, the question is, who is deciding the agenda of research and where the resources come from? And it's not the responsibility of the Western, it's the responsibility of African societies and countries to just decide what is their research agenda and to put resources there. And to just think that it's an important investment to do. They are caught in a lot of emergencies and they don't think that investing in research is urgent. So they leave that space. So at the same time, they don't invest in the knowledge they need to get rid of their emergencies in few years. So this is so for me the critical question is how to build an African research agenda that just tackle the critical issues of African societies and that doesn't depend. If you have two universities that decide to collaborate in the basis of an equal agenda research, yes, why not? But it's not the question for me. I distinguish the individual trajectories of researchers. I was in an economics department. I wanted to go in a more transdisciplinary settings, and I find it, and I go there to have the space to think transdisciplinary and to push further my research. So it's an individual trajectory. But I think the question is not the individual trajectories. It's the global framework and how we think the research agenda of the countries. The question of restitutions, I think, yes, it's a question. What may look like, what African societies should be if these objects weren't there. So at the beginning of the restitution report, I was very interested in this idea of loss. So 90% of the African cultural heritage is outside, etc., etc. So there are claims and demand, so they have to return in which condition, those questions. But moving ahead, I just slightly think beyond, that categories. I just realized that yes, it's true. A lot of material artifacts are outside, but African societies were able to survive, to reproduce themselves, to transmit their cultural heritage through material and immaterial cultural heritage. And it's been that they have survived the loss. And I start thinking how they were able to survive the loss, because the art survived the ruins. So the knowledge they had they embodied those type of knowledge, and they were able to reproduce it. And so the question slightly changed for me. And I think that we will never know what would be the trajectories. It's a counterfactual. But what is interesting for me is to see when these objects return, how we socialize them, and which new meanings can we give to these resources to build future. And for me, the idea is that we have to rely on all our resources. So the material and the immaterial at the same time. And these resources that have been trapped outside, when they came, how are we using them as fuel to reinvent in our laboratories the social dynamics, the aesthetic, the philosophical, the cultural dynamics?
I want to do two things, and if you would allow me, because one of the things that I don't want to do is that the entire conversation is around Africa's problems. And therefore, I'd like to reorient some of our concern to some of actually the more hopes, dreams, and desires of a possible future that are in how you have presented as well. So if your question right now, and I'm sorry if what I just said cut it off, but Esme, Ilaria, sorry, I missed out. Question, two questions, and we do both together again.
Thank you so much for this, like, expanding field of hope that you are bringing into thinking about how to proceed. My question is about spirituality, because you mentioned the inception of religious studies, and I suppose spirituality in a wider sense than religion, into the pensum, this new pensum of epistemological justice and so on. And I would love to hear a little bit more. It doesn't need to be long, but a little bit more.
All right.
Thank you very much. I'm not an academic. I'm a politician. I've been a member of parliament here in Holland for the last 7 years for the Green Party. And your analysis of the dominance of knowledge is very... I recognize a lot of it in the political fight we're fighting here in the Netherlands as well. There's a very strong dominance of knowledge and therefore of power. And you're giving a new perspective on knowledge, which is also very hopeful, I don't think only for the African continent, but also for us. And what I was wondering is, you are working both on the African continent and in America and in Europe also. How is the reception of your theory of knowledge? I could imagine you see some differences, and I would like to know where you are most optimistic about. Is it the reception of your theory in Africa or in Europe or in America? And what obstacles do you encounter in the spheres of power?
You promised a small question, eh?
Sorry.
In African countries or in African universities, when you say there is African epistemologies, they know it's a common knowledge. They feel it because they've been used in their personal life. They experience those type of knowledge to heal themselves, to do something, and it's not very difficult to put this idea in a theoretical framework, because it's an idea that also is backed by an experience and transmissions. So it's, I won't say evident, but they know it. They know that there is here epistemologies. They know it. Sometimes when they try to heal themselves and the hospital is not good, they go to see a knowing man or woman in a place that just solve the questions. They don't know how this knowledge operates, but they know that this knowledge operates. So it's less difficult. When you came in a Western settings, when you start to say that science is not the only way of knowing, there is a lot of suspicions, because knowledge is science. If you say that science is a part of the way of knowing, but as the society has organized on a technical know-how that came from science, it's obvious that the science is the only way of knowing. Even though you have an affirmation, you're asked, is it scientifically proven? You say, yes, it's true. So there's a real hegemony in the imaginaries of the scientific knowledge upon the other knowledge. Even though you have a knowledge that operates, you have to prove scientifically that this knowledge operates. So it's the question of incommensurability. You have to take the scientific criteria to just prove that your knowledge is valid. So there is a work to do, an epistemological work about what is knowing, how to know, different types of knowledge. They are not the same. They could interact. They have different regime of truth, of validity, and we have to just be able to acknowledge all the diversity and see how this diversity is able to dialogue. And here also, it's a walk through the imaginaries of what knowing means, etc. etc. And you have different type of knowledge, implicit, embodied, tacit, etc. etc. that are not scientific or theoretical. To cross a road, you need a lot of knowledge. If you see a car coming, you articulate different types of knowledge in your body, in the pace, physical knowledge, topographic knowledge, etc., intuitions, just to come across the road. So it's much more difficult, but I think with the stream of thought about the decolonial thinking, indigenous knowledge, all this type of experience that now are knocking at the door of the academy, it has become less difficult just to explain, that we have to widen the geography of the so-called reason. And even though Western philosophers, Henri Bergson, a lot of had put as a ways of knowings, in their frameworks. So it exists also in the margin of the dominant epistemology. It's not just from outside, but from the inside also. Spirituality is for us an epistemology. And when we built that new faculty in Saint-Louis, we decided that we will open, and you're absolutely right, it was a faculty of religion and spirituality. And because spirituality is very important in African societies, and it's a way also of relating and knowing, and we bring that space in the university with thinkers, social scientists, etc., to take that object seriously, not just something that is outside of the reason, but something that we can understand, reflect on it, and also consider it as a way of knowing. So,
I want to shift just a little bit, just because I want to talk a little bit about your writing and music, and just as also a way of knowing. And what investments do you have in, or should we have in the speculative possibility of what theater offers us, or your literary work, or just the relationship between art and music and knowing? One of the things I wanted to go back to, I was saying to a student recently, that also a part of the 1960s movement towards independence was they were developing national dance theater companies and all this kind of art, spaces for art. What is the work of the labor of the creative and the embodied in the futures that you are trying to help us imagine?
I've always thought that these different disciplines, they were necessary to build what I call an experience at the crossroad of social science, human sciences, arts, etc., etc. And probably it's because I'm a musician and a writer that I was very skeptical when I was at the university on the absolute truth of my disciplines. I understood, I would say, organically, by reading poetry or writing poetry, that sometimes you understand and you don't know. You read a line of poetry, you receive the emotions, but you don't understand with your brain, but you have a different type of understanding. Music brings you in a different type of experiencing, understanding, feeling that is not mediated by the scientific knowledge, but you know that you have understood what happens here. And I just started from taking seriously those places. For a long time, I have divided them. I was doing my music and my literary work, and I was doing my scientific work apart. And through times, I understood that I have to bridge them. And I have just to rebel myself against the dichotomizing of this category. And just the fact that attributing to the scientific knowledge or the rational one all the qualities and undermining what came from art, sensibility, as just being a subjective way of relating to the world, but not an important way of knowing. But it took me a lot of time just to bring back all together and to go outside of the divisions. But what saved me is that I have started by music and literature before being a scholar. And I had a kind of knowledge of that, and I knew that there was a space of understanding reality. And when I became a scholar, I would say that I had tools that allows me not to be exclusively captured in one epistemological framework. But one have to prove that you know your epistemological framework to articulate another one and to be listened in another one, because it's kind of dynamics, etc. But yeah.
No, it's interesting you say that, because one of last year's Gerbrands laureate, she just published a book where her opening foil is that she was a dancer before she became an academic, and actually that has influenced how she becomes an academic, because she learned first through her body and not through words. There is one last question that I can afford, I think, for the timing, because yeah. Peter, no, you can't have the last question. So there is him and one other. Peter. All right, I'll take the last question after him, but Peter first.
Thanks so much, Felwine, for this wonderful talk and conversation. I wanted to continue a little bit on that last point, because I learned a lot from, for instance, African or African American literature about feelings, affect, emotions that I probably wouldn't have been. I don't know in any case, and I wouldn't be able to understand without that kind of knowledge. But there's a paradox there between the knowing and the emotional part somehow. And we also faced with a society that has a lot of, let me put it this way, emotions going around that serve to bar people from knowing each other, right? Like fear about migrants, for instance, or comparable things. How do you position yourself in a field like that? And to what extent do you think that certain, say, musical or poetic interventions can make people sense and therefore understand other things than they are used to?
Really, to be honest, I don't think that music or poetry could solve the fear of the migrants. I don't think so. I think that it's a question of social discourse, really. The psychology of the group. The politicians, they know that it's very easy to excite the fear and to build on the fear. They could have different types of narratives. So the first type of narrative is who is part of the group, who is part of the community. So normally we are all part of the same community. I don't come from Jupiter or Mars, so I'm part of the human community. And how are we able to build the community outside of the negative alterity? We are a community because we have the same languages, and those guys are not part of the community. So I think there is something to do here in the space of the feeling of belonging, how to articulate a social discourse that includes the other or the alien, etc., etc. So there is a social discourse that just excludes them from the community. So if they are not part of the community, they don't deserve care, they don't deserve education, they don't deserve to be here, it's not their place, etc., etc. And I think the philosopher, the scholars, the thinker, they have a responsibility on just deconstructing that discourse, and the politicians also. Because even though they know that it's easier to build on that, to have votes, they have to just highlight the society and bring the society in another place, not just nurturing the fear of the society. So I think there is here an intellectual, a philosophical responsibility to just, if you take the question of migration, all the European countries, they know that they need migrants for economic purpose, for democratic purpose, for civilization. All the human civilization are incomplete. They need their alterity to be outside of the cycle of the thermodynamic. So they know that, but at the same time, they just want to please to their right wings. So I think the place is there. It's beautiful to go to a concert of of a migrant from Iran and Iraq and Senegal and enjoy the music and say, oh, it's beautiful, but it doesn't solve the political questions, and the political question must be addressed politically and intellectually.
Yeah, there's one more question. Oh, good, they saved Peter from not being the last.
Thank you.
Oh,
It's-
the
it's me
second
again.
question. Okay,
Yes.
okay.
Thank you. My question is, how have you been thinking about the role of diaspora in reimagining a radical other life? As diaspora myself, mostly raised in Europe, and working for a colonial Leiden university, my PhD was also at a very colonial university. But my family ties in Ghana are very strong. I've been thinking about my positionality as colonized colonizer, so hyphenated. We are at a high risk, I mean diaspora, of reproducing coloniality by enriching our careers while claiming to speak for some supposed population to a largely white audience. So that is something, that is a risk that I think as diaspora we have, speaking to a white audience while supposedly speaking on behalf of a population. So I wanted to ask you, what is our responsibility as diaspora? Who are we? And what humble role do we play in reimagining a radical alternative future? How have you been thinking about this? Thank you.
I think there is two dimensions in your question. The first is the university and what you call the colonial university. There is a lot of critiques that you can address to the universities, but there is also a lot of advantage in being in a university. It means that the tools of critical thinking allow you to think again your intellectual genealogy. University is a place where you can criticize the knowledge that is produced by the university. There is a lot of places where you don't have the rules or the tools to criticize the knowledge that you acquire. So university allows you to be inside and outside at the same time, to have one foot in it and to be able to reflect on what type of institution you are. So I think if you're a critical thinking, no matter the space you are able to just become a critic and choose what is relevant and what is not relevant. And university allow that. We dedicate a lot of time being able to being able to be critical. So you can think against your own genealogy, your own intellectual genealogy. But also I think that once is not just the produce of your university, you're the produce of your social environment, of your family, of different type of knowledge, of the conversation you have. So you have a lot of universities that produce you as an individuals. The stories of your grandmother, etc., your friends, all these are epistemic spaces. And sometimes we just think that we are the only products of the university. No, we are not the product. We are the product of a multiplicity of space of knowings. And we can navigate those spaces, and we can just take tools here to reflect on what is happening in this space, vice versa. What I find interesting in the diasporas is the ability they have to make synthesis. I came from Ghana, I came from Senegal, I was born here, raised here, I moved here. I have a smell, a trace, a kind of empathy with that culture that I understand. So I can move beyond the words and just take what I find best and better in the different environments. So I think they have the ability of articulating what is most interesting from the different space they come. And it is, I think, the most interesting contribution of the diasporas to articulate different words.
And because I have the mic, and because we are here in this museum, I wanted to close and give you the option of answering two questions that I've toyed with since you started. You can just choose which one you think is easy and at the end. But one that strikes me is that much of the debate, even as we speak today, but much of the debate about restitution often falls trapped to a developmentalism. We need to go and build their capacity over there. I'd like to ask you the question, is it possible to do that? That's one possible question. Or the other one that you can answer is, a museum like this, as you described it, perhaps was part of and parcel of the creation of the Colonial Library. It was part and parcel of creating the the ethnography of which you speak, but it was also part and parcel of separating Africa into an Africa that we look at, but an Africa in our displays that is cognitive, scientific, whatever, and not that could embody movement, dance. Because the museum is very often very ocular in a particular kind of way and not other things. So what would a museum look like if it were to embody the dream that for a particular kind of different episteme that you're imagining? And you can choose any one or both. Two of them.
So probably the question of the museum being an ocular place is very interesting for me. If you go back to the origin in the 19th centuries of the Western Museum, it was a place where you hold the object that tell the identity of the community. And it's why those objects were inalienable. So you can't sell them because they are here to reflect, to tell the history of the Khmer community. When you build an ethnological museum, you take objects from another community that you integrate in your national patrimony. So the museum that was supposed to be the museum of the we, you build a museum of the others. And this is the question. And you produce a discourse on the others outside of them, outside of their voices. But if you reflect on the question of musealizing the civilization of the other, so putting the civilization of the other or the artifact in your museum, it's a way of silencing the radical interrogation that the other culture can ask you. So I put them in the museum with my displays, so they are not interrogating me anymore in their own terms, but I have produced the discourse of the encounter. So Europe has done that, not engaging with the alterity, but silencing the radical questioning of the alterity by putting in its own museums the culture of the other, and by being the one who display, who produce the discourse outside of them. And you're right, one of the limitations of the debate on the restitutions is that the terms of the debate are framed in the Western epistemology. They say, okay, we have to give back, but we have to ensure that you are able to take care of them, that you have museums, that the Khmer conservation is not a problem. But if you listen, the baseline of that is behind is that, are you able to replicate our own dispositive in your country? So it's a colonial process. And the question is not having a museum or not, the question is how those societies were able to patrimonialize their object. Different objects had different social role, and the museum is one ecology, but some can go in markets, in communities, in schools, in village, in different places, and they can activate the social space from different places. And this society has a way of dealing with the idea of patrimony. They have their own knowledge of how to just socialize these objects. So the question is that we have taken your object, we have re-semanticized them in our own dispositive, and by giving them back, we are asking you to replicate our own dispositive. This is colonial, absolutely colonial. So, and unfortunately, we have to respond first to those questions that were not the good questions. Say, oh, we have museum, we have knowledge of conservation. All objects are stolen in our museum, but they are also stolen in France, in Louvre, and in different places extra. So this is not the question, but we have to answer. So we have to just cross the first line of the colonial question before being able to have a real conversation. And I think now, probably we are entering the real conversation beyond, I would say, the Khmer colonial question. So you're absolutely right. So the question is not building museum in Africa, is thinking what role, what places, what status, how to socialize them, and how African societies are able to integrate these artifacts in their dynamic. They can build a museum, okay, but they can do different type of think and different type of ecologies in different places. So you can take a fisher net and bring it to the university in the center of research because they have knowledge of algorithmic and fractals that are in fisher's net. You can take a mask, bring it to the school of design, where young designer will be just inspired by the ancient forms. You can take artifacts in front of a market, so people, when they are going to a market, they see it. They don't have to go to the museum. You can bring back some object in some community if they want them. You have a lot of possibility, and you can bring some object to a museum.
Nice. I think that I could suggest that I'm at this point as I grow older, becoming more interested in poetry as well. And there's this one poet called Podrick Otuma, who from Ireland, and in reflecting on what poetry can do for us, he sees poetry as teachers, the ability to help us by making something together, that it can help us to reach probably where Peter was talking about, an understanding of ourselves as humans, not as migrants, not as foreigner, not as whatever, but a kind of common humanity. And it is with how you just describe that possibility of what objects could do, but with your practice in music and in writing, that we wanted to imagine what a future museum could look like. And that is what I feel that you gave us today. What a possible, not just a possible university or a possible place for learning, but also this kind of institution. And my last story before we close, where science comes together with science, and I told a few people this before, is that I have a brother-in-law who lost his wife recently, and in losing his wife, I went to visit him and he was crying. And the reason why he was crying because she didn't dream him. It's not about him dreaming about her. It is about her spirits dreaming him. And in one moment, I realized that in all of his belief in science and in real science and in university, he also believed that the spirits are real and that the spirits live with him, and that until she dreamed him, then he cannot rest because her spirit needs to dream him. So perhaps what you're inviting us to do is to imagine a world that is not so epistemologically or ontologically divided, but spirit worlds live with other knowledge worlds, with other being worlds. Ladies and gentlemen, and I should not have said that, and other gendered possibilities, gender diversity, I want to invite you to help me thank Professor Sarr for being with us and for inspiring us to think with him about what another future could look like.